Hello, this is Zeynep from Istanbul, and thank you for listening. In my presentation, I would like to introduce you to a Turkish periodical, Resimli Hayat, in English Illustrated Life, and focus on how the American image was presented in the magazine. Resimli Hayat was a monthly magazine, and its first issue was published in May 1952. For more than 3 years, it was published continuously until July 1955. On the copyright page, Resimli Hayat was presented as a monthly magazine on current events, women, fashion, theater, cinema, sports and art, with photos. A brief content analysis shows that the most common topics in the magazine were the news about domestic and global incidents, the latest news about cinema, mostly Hollywood, interviews with local and foreign celebrities, news and recommendations about fashion, indigenous and translated literary works, mostly short stories, informative articles on health and childcare, questionnaires, Q&A columns, and articles on relationships and marriage. Additionally, various advertisements also occupied a considerable space in the magazine. What's interesting is that almost in every single issue of Resimli Hayat, there was at least one headline directly or indirectly related to the USA. Resimli Hayat published 39 issues, and when we look through the tables of content, we can see that 22 headlines included the word America and 11 more included Hollywood. Additionally, a close reading of the magazine shows that the content related to the USA was not limited to within these headlines. Therefore, it wouldn't be wrong to argue that Resimli Hayat played a significant role in building and promoting the American image in a Turkish context in the 1950s. To be able to understand the Turkish context, let me briefly introduce the sociopolitical background in Turkey in the second half of the 20th century, and then we can have a closer look at the content of the magazine. As we all know, the political power balance in the world changed right after the Second World War, and a new power struggle began between two opponents, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The whole world had been affected by the result of this struggle, and of course, Turkey was not an exception. Despite being able to remain impartial during the war, Turkey had to choose a side in this new struggle. In March 1945, the USSR officially denounced the Treaty of Friendship with Turkey that was signed back in 1925. In return for the renewal of this treaty, the Soviet government asked for a new convention on the Turkish Straits, which would be in favor of the Soviets. The historian Feroz Ahmet states that, I quote, Stalin's aggressive behavior towards Turkey in 1945 facilitated the rapprochement with the West in general and the United States in particular. End of quote. Following the Strait crisis in 1946, the USA showed its support for Turkey in opposition to the USSR by designating Turkey as a recipient of special economic and military assistance under the provisions of the Truman Doctrine, so that Turkey would remain as the chief controller of the Straits and could resist the Soviet threats as well. In addition to that, Turkey started to receive another aid from the States within the scope of Marshall Plan in 1948. Therefore, with the motifs of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, Turkey's integration into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1952 was a declaration of its side in the struggle between the USA and the USSR. When it came to the local politics, on 14 May 1950, the Democrat Party, the DP, won the national elections in Turkey. The DP had already started to promote the USA as their new ally and the role model for modernization of Turkey during their election campaigns, and continued to do so throughout the decade. In one of his speeches, Celal Bayar, the founder of the DP and later the third president of Republic of Turkey, stated, from my translation I quote, "In our country we are trying to follow Americans' progress. We hope that in the next 30 years this blessed country with its 50 million population will become the Little America." End of quote. so that the DP used the Marshall Aid to this end in the 1950s. Along with the financial aid from the USA, new consumer goods such as tractors, motor vehicles, domestic appliances, food and health products were also imported to Turkey. All these items were slowly integrated into people's daily life. The imported items were not only limited to consumer goods. Through translation, the American culture was also imported to Turkey. Journalist and researcher Ahmet Oktay argues that Americanization of the press in the 1950s was also part of the Marshall Plan, and he also states that wisely selected American books and periodicals were very effective in creating a new ideology and disseminating the American lifestyle in Turkey. At this point, we can turn back to Resim Hayat and have a closer look at its content. A comparative analysis shows that Resimli Hayat was imitating some foreign periodicals, such as Parimach and Life, in terms of both content production and design. It should be noted that Parimach was a weekly magazine published in French, and it was also imitating the American magazine Life. Translations from these and some other foreign periodicals were frequently used as a method of content production in Resimli Hayat. However, it is not always easy to trace the source text because some of this content can be considered as concealed translations, where both the translator and the author is invisible. But it is still remarkable that America was promoted almost in every single issue by either translated or indigenous works. And I believe Şevket Rado plays a crucial role here as the editor-in-chief. Şevket Rado was a journalist, radio programmer, and a poet, and he was also a close relative of Orhan Pamuk. Rado is mostly known as the publisher and the editor of the most popular Turkish magazines such as Aile, Resimli Hayat, Hayat, and Ses. In my case, Rado appears as a crucial agent in Resimli Hayat, who was the editor-in-chief and played an important role in the selection of content to be translated and the presentation of the translated material for Turkish readers of the magazine. He also wrote a column titled Radyo Sohbetleri in the magazine, where he published his radio talks that lasted 10 minutes. The subject of his articles can be categorized as advice on life and personal growth. In his articles, Rado often referred to American authors and researchers to support his ideas, and he always praised the American community and their lifestyle. In 1953, the USA government invited several journalists from the member states of the NATO to the States, and Şevket Rado was among the Turkish group. When he came back to Turkey, he told his observations and impressions about the USA in his radio program, and also published his talk in the January issue of Resimli Hayat in 1954. He wrote about the states in glowing terms. He was impressed by the factories which could produce 5 cars in 10 minutes, and people who made use of every single minute by working. Appreciating the hardworking Americans, Rado wrote that, from my translation I quote, "The motto, less talk, more work, was adopted in America and carefully applied as a rule by American people." End of quote. In his talk, Rado also compared the daily life of Americans to Europeans in terms of financial opportunities, and wrote that the Americans had every kind of technological appliances in their houses, which made their life easier and more pleasant. As a conclusion, he wrote that, from my translation I quote, "America has so developed in every field that it has almost nothing to do with European civilization." End of quote. Not only in this specific piece, but also in other issues of the magazine, Rado continues to praise the USA. Therefore, it's not surprising to see that most of the translated content in Resimli Hayat was dedicated to promote the American image in the Turkish context. Now we can have a closer look how the USA was presented in the magazine. As I mentioned before, almost in every issue of Resimli Hayat, there is at least one headline about the USA. Some of them were translations from various foreign sources such as Parimage, Parents Magazine, Reader's Digest, or Psychology, etc. Some were written by Turkish journalists for Resimli Hayat. Sometimes it is difficult to identify the source of the news, but either political or more casual developments that occurred in the States were reported regularly. For example, in one issue, the new mailboat United States was described in detail. In another issue, the White House was introduced to the Turkish readers, or in different issues, important names such as President Eisenhower and his wife or American Deputy Defense Minister Anna Rosenberg were introduced to the readers in articles where they were highly spoken of. News on art and hobbies were also introduced in Resimli Hayat. And the fourth issue that was published in August 1952, The Art of Sculpture in the USA, was introduced to the readers. In the article, European and American interpretations of the art were compared, and the latter was praised as its focus on nature. At the end of the article, it was noted that Turkey also needed such an understanding and interpretation of this art. In another issue, an article where Ernest A.K. wrote in Philately was translated from Think magazine. Introduced as a common hobby among Americans, philately was recommended as a joyful way to study history for children and a relaxing activity for adults. In the sixth issue of Resimli Hayat, the article titled The Women Reign in America was translated from the magazine The Woman Banker, and in this article, the most wealthy women in the States were introduced in order to overcome the prejudice that men dominate the business world. In Resimli Hayat, a considerable number of pages were dedicated to the news from Hollywood. In these pages, the latest movies were announced, interviews with celebrities and gossip about them were published with many photos. Hollywood was closely followed by many countries. The movies were reaching millions and celebrities had a vast number of fans from all around the world. It is difficult to trace the main source for all these articles and news on Hollywood, but they can be considered as concealed translations which helped to build an American dream for the Turkish readers. In Resimli Hayat, Hollywood was followed, but also it was noted in the 26th issue that Resimli Hayat had been followed by Hollywood stars too. According to the news, even though they did not understand Turkish, the celebrities enjoyed the magazine's visual material. As a monthly magazine, Resimli Hayat published many short stories, both indigenous and translated pieces, in terms of literature. The popular American authors such as Ernest Hemingway, Pearl Buck, John Steinbeck, and James Thurber were translated into Turkish and published in the magazine. In these literary translations, the translators were more visible compared to news in the magazine, and even though the titles changed time to time, it is easier to detect the source text as well. Generally, the selected works were the popular examples of the time, and they were presented as the best examples of the modern American literature. As previously mentioned, thanks to the financial aid from the USA, the purchasing power of the Turkish community had risen during the 1950s. At the same time, various American products had been imported to the local market, and these products were introduced and promoted by printed advertisements. At this point, Resimli Hayat should be considered as a fruitful ground to analyze these ads. In every issue, especially ads on domestic appliances and food items such as margarine brand Sana, occupied a considerable space. These products have changed the daily life of Turkish families and their consumption habits. Today, Unilever's margarine brand in Turkey, Sana, still stands as an umbrella term of its kind in the local market. In addition to the advertisements which were clearly targeting women, there were also ads which were targeting men, such as tractor ads by Alice Chalmers and some other motor vehicles. Through the Democrat Party's investment on the road network, Resimli Hayat was able to be distributed across almost all of Anatolia, where agriculture was the main income. And in the 1950s, with the Marshall Plan, A huge number of tractors were also imported to Turkey and they needed to be sold. So Resimli Hayat was a perfect spot for these ads. Again, in those ads, the advanced American technology was praised and presented as the best vehicles for modern agricultural activities. There are many other examples which would support the idea that Resimli Hayat was promoting the American image in the Turkish context through different ways. The USA was always described as a new role model for art and literature, and the American community was idealized as the most developed community at which Turkey aimed to reach. The news and articles were presenting the USA as a reliable ally and friend of Turkey. And all the ads were promoting American products and technology as they were must-have items and would change and make easier the daily domestic affairs. And all this policy followed by the magazine was not coincidental. It was in parallel with the dominant political developments in the country and the personal views of the editor, Şevket Rado in particular. Thank you for listening. I will be happy to hear your comments and answer your questions.